about a month ago, I made a video on how to incentivize game development for the Gameshell, which is a console that I picked up recently. I'm super stoked on it. It's really cool. Like, you can probably find videos that are way better than mine reviewing it and talking about it. Basically, it has these little screw latchy 180-degree turny knobby things, and the whole thing opens up. And each thing is kind of built into these little modules. So there's the screen module, there's the keypad module, speaker module, and the thing runs Linux, like a bleeding edge kernel, which is kind of crazy. It has a all-winner R16 inside of it, which you probably might be able to see. It's got this cool Lego back-end thing. The keypad is running a separate board here, which I believe is like an Atmega 32, running Arduino, so you get like these breakout things, and it comes with this little trigger thing for more buttons. Anyway, so it's a rad console. I made a video on how to make incentivized kind of game development for it. It was like basically me just rambling, and I thought of a cool idea that I thought would be easy, and it turns out that it's not. So in the olden days, back when proprietary consoles, handheld consoles ruled the world, if you were a random person and you wanted to develop a game on one of these guys, you were pretty much SOL. The companies, Nintendo, Sony, created these development kits that would only be provided to serious development companies to essentially develop games on the consoles. And what the kits did, it was a bridge from your computer to the actual console itself, and it would provide debugging and probably would have like a compiler to be able to compile everything, maybe a bunch of like libraries that you're allowed to use. And now that we have all this cool new tech and open source stuff, that development bridge is enabled for anyone. So you'd be able to buy one of these, connect it to Wi-Fi, cross-compile a game, and basically just SCP the file over, which is just like a file transfer protocol, and then run it on the target. And so what I wanted to do was to be able to cross-compile the Amethyst game engine and to be able to run it on this guy. And this video is effectively documenting my failure on that and why it's harder than it sounds. And what cross-compilation is, for those who don't know, is compiling an application for a processor that isn't the processor that you're compiling the application on. So as an example, this is a all-winner R16, which is an ARM processor. So it has the ARM v7 32-bit instruction set. So if I wanted to compile something for there, I wouldn't be able to just compile it on my x86 machine, because if I ran it on there, it would just blow up. It's a different instruction set. So I would download the ARM GNU Linux cross compiler and would run that on this machine here, and then I would be able to send the files over there and run them. I thought it would be easy, but it turns out that I don't actually know very much about like graphics backend stuff and stuff like that. So what I did, I started out with my little MacBook, and I basically am going to start screen recording. So first of all, I had to install the GNU ARM v7 toolchain. So what that looks like is basically ARM Linux GNU, so that's GCC for ARM basically. And so on my MacBook, I used Brew to install that, and those gave me a bunch of binaries that I could use to cross-compile. And then in Rust, you can basically say rust up, add target, and then you add this special cross-compiler. And then I'm like, okay, cool, I'm off to the races. And then you basically say You set this cargo config thing where you can set different targets, and the whole thing is like so well thought out. I'm like, okay, this is brilliant. And then you do cargo build, and then you specify your target with this command line option, and then the whole thing goes and starts compiling, and everything's good, and then it blows up on a crate. X11, it doesn't like to be cross-compiled. So I'm like, crap, and I'm looking around, and there was a bunch of stuff, and I'm like, okay, weird. So I looked around, and people are like, okay, no, this crate doesn't want to be like X11 itself doesn't want to be cross-compiled. So I threw that away, and then I'm like, okay, maybe it might be because I'm on OS X, and this shit is better than Windows, but it's not as good as like Ubuntu or Linux. And so I spun up a Amazon AWS instance, Ubuntu like 19 point whatever they're on, and then I tried to cross compile, and I got the exact same problem. So I guess no surprise there, really. There's an issue with cross compilation. So then I spun up a AWS ARM instance, because they have these ARM instances. I compiled it, and then at this point you don't have to cross compile. You're like straight compiling the application. So I compiled it, and then I downloaded it to this thing, and it totally blew up. And I'm like, what the hell? And it turns out that let's see. Okay, this is a different. Okay, so that's my next issue. And then it turns out that I did things really fast and I didn't notice, and the AWS instance was actually ARM 64-bit. So I looked, and that's not going to work. And I tried cross compiling to 32-bit on that guy, and that didn't work either. So then, and then I'm like, okay, you know what? I'm just going to compile on this thing. So, which is kind of insane. So I installed the Rust toolchain, which is like one curl command, and then cloned the Amethyst repository, which would not the Amethyst repository, my little special Gameshell Amethyst, where I'm trying to get this thing working, and then I just straight compiled it on the Gameshell, and it got like friggin' hot. So I put it in the fridge, and which is kind of like the coolest thing when I was doing it. I'm like, this is so insane. Like, you're compiling on this tiny little piece of hardware, and it took like an hour or whatever, which is to be expected. But then a binary came out, which is crazy. So, I mean, it's not that crazy because, again, it's running Linux, and you should be able, like, it compiled like however the hell many libraries are inside of Amethyst. Without a problem. It got real hot, and then I ran it, and it totally blew up, and I got this error here. And this is where I start to get tripped up with my complete, like, utter ignorance of how graphics backend libraries work. So this guy here has a graphics backend. It has two different ones. There's a GPU one, which is better for games because it's a GPU library called Lima, which does not support Vulkan. But Lima is like this open source people who built this graphics backend for like ARM processors. There's some like brilliant people out there that are like doing God's work and making, like, that's not an easy thing to do. So yeah, that exploded because it doesn't support Vulkan, and then I got that. And what is the next thing I did? And then and then I was talking on the Amethyst Discord, and people were like, well, you could write your own graphics backend, and I'm like, that seems really hard. I don't really want to do that right now, even though we are in like quarantine. And then one of the dudes is like, okay, well, Amethyst is starting to support WASM, WebAssembly, and OpenGL. And I'm like, okay, the Lima graphics driver on this guy supports OpenGL. So then I'm like, okay, so I cloned the the Wasm branch of Amethyst, which is still like heavily under development, and I compiled it on this guy again, and there were a bunch of problems, so I had to use the cargo patching function, which is pretty cool. You can like if your crate if crate that you're using has dependencies that are blowing up, because since this is 32-bit, there was some 32-bit stuff that it was exploding, so I had to take, there's Amethyst, and that had crates imported inside of it, and those ones were exploding, so I cloned those ones, used the Amethyst, or the Rust patch, cargo patch function, to fix those bugs, basically go in and made a bunch of a couple changes, and then compiled on this thing, and then ran it, and OpenGL exploded. This is the first explosion, that doesn't matter. I fixed that because that was trying to pull things over X windows, which is basically a whole other thing. It's like graphical. So I had to write some scripts to like run the thing on the device rather than running it over SSH, because I tried to pull everything over X windows. And then I got this like final thing which I'm totally stuck on. Well, not totally. I've spent like 20 minutes on it, but I can't really find anything. Panicked, result, unwrap, error, invalid enum. Somewhere in the GL source info. And that is it. This was just like a giant rant about, not rant, like talk about why it was hard to do all of these things. Anyways, so I'm gonna rewatch this video and see if it's insane or not. It might be insane, and I'm not gonna post it. Yeah, so that was that. It's kind of a fail video of how I just couldn't figure it out yet, but I do think that running Amethyst or getting Amethyst to compile, cross-compile in the future would be cool. Because you're given a lot with that engine. It's super badass. And yeah, so we'll see what happens in the future.